Good morning. I was told that there were people joining online. Yeah, here's the camera, I think. Good morning, welcome. Unfortunately, our speakers had some issues traveling to the venue, so we are still waiting for them. But in the meantime, we will already start with providing some context why we're here, why are we having this event, and what's going on the EU level. And they shall arrive very shortly. So thank you for being with us and bearing with us. So why are we here? LNG imports from the US to the EU have increased very significantly in the past years. The first shipment happened in 2016, so this is all a fairly new development. And since the further invasion of Ukraine, the exports have, of mainly fracked gas, by the way, have increased even more sharply. Between 21 and 2022, the increase was 150%. So that's a very rapid increase in very short time. And these imports could increase even further in the future. And billions of euros are currently being spent on the expansion of LNG import infrastructure all across Europe, basically. However, what are the costs for this build out? What will the impacts be on US communities that actually suffer from environmental, social consequence that we will hear about from this thirst about LNG in Europe? And yeah, what will happen if we pursue that way of first and foremost replacing Russian pipeline gas with LNG without more ambitious pathways to actually swiftly reduce the fossil gas dependency in the first place? And we have today, they're coming, leaders from frontline communities in Texas and Louisiana. These are the hotspots of exports of LNG. And they will explain to us what it actually means on site for them. But before we dive into their perspectives, we will hear from Enrico Donda from Food and Water Action Europe. What are the EU files that are currently in discussions that connect to this LNG expansion and the gas thirst in Europe? So thank you, Enrico, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Is it working? Yeah. Good morning, everyone, first of all. And thank you for connecting online. I know it's early, and thank you very much for the effort. So we are here today to hear the stories from people directly impacted by LNG and petrochemical expansions in the US, and particularly, as Lisa said, in Texas and Louisiana, that are hotspots for LNG exports in the US. But we are here because I think their fight is not only their fight, but it's also our fight, meaning that the European Union is one of the largest importer of fossil fuels in the world. And we heavily rely on LNG, especially after the invasions of Ukraine by Russia. So discussing today LNG export from the US is a very important topic. The US are the main suppliers of LNG to the EU, and most of this gas is fracked gas, meaning that it is highly polluting. It releases high quantity of methane emissions and other toxic pollutants. And this is a direct impact also on local community, of course, and the environment. But it's also closely related to the discussions we have here at the European Union level, because there are many legislative files under discussions. Next year, there will be the European elections, so the EU bodies need to wrap up all the legislative files that are currently under negotiation. And many of these legislative files are very relevant also for the discussions that we have here today. I will just mention a few, then we can maybe talk further about them. But just to mention a few very legislative files that's very relevant, I will mention the gas package and the methane regulation that are currently under trialogue phase at the European institution level. And in particular, the methane regulation is associated with the control of methane leaks and methane emissions in the atmosphere. This is a key legislative files, and it's key to apply it to the whole supply chain, meaning from the upstream to the downstream. segment of the supply chain. And it's a critical text to control, to limit global warming under 1.5 degrees, according to the international commitments of the EU. But the discussion today also is related to, for example, other proposal of the European Union, as the Repower EU that was released just after the invasions of Ukraine, in a way to shift away from fossil fuels and support renewable energies. Even though it has some positive aspects, though it still supports fossil gas infrastructures and is still financing the constructions of new LNG terminals, for example, in some European countries as France, Germany, Estonia, and other countries all around Europe. But and it also supports then the new pipelines and gas infrastructure in general in the European Union. But besides this, I think that it's very important also to mention that imports from the US of LNG and gas also has an impact on, as we said, environment, but also human rights, for example, human rights violation. Now the European Union is discussing the due diligence directive that is very important also for, as it concerns human rights violation and environmental breaches. We can discuss this further, but it's also applied to the supply chain. So even the discussion today about US LNG will be a relevant one. And just to give you a final remark, I think that this discussion today is also part of a larger picture, that of the phase out of fossil fuels. The European Union doesn't have a clear deadline for the phase out of fossil fuels yet, even though at international level it supports a phase out deadline by 2050, according to other, according also to other commitments at the international level, as for example, recently the G7 in Japan in May that confirmed the willingness to phase out fossil fuels by 2050, but still we don't have a clear deadline. So I think the discussion today, it's very important to understand that gas is not clean, even though it comes from the US and not Russia. So we need to phase out fossil fuels as soon as possible, in all forms, as soon as possible. Yeah.
Thank you. As we are unfortunately still waiting for the other speakers, they are somehow stuck in traffic. I don't know what happened. So maybe we can talk about why the LNG from the US is actually that methane intensive, because Food and Water Action has worked quite extensively on that. Just in the, I'll let the speakers arrive. I see that they have just come. Maybe just a few words, why is LNG actually more methane emitting, or at least not environmentally more friendly than pipeline gas? What is the problem with LNG in the first place?
So the main component of gas is methane. And methane is released all across the supply chain, meaning from the point of production till the final consumers. So even like in gas stoves and boilers at home, we have release of methane emissions. So methane is released everywhere, and there are leaks everywhere all along the supply chain. In the case of LNG, is particularly critical because, as we said before, LNG in the US is mainly fracked gas. Fracking is a very dangerous technology, meaning that it pollutes the water and the land, but it also releases high quantity of methane in the atmosphere, and it contributed a lot to the increasing of global temperature in the last year, especially after the Industrial World War. So a very high quantity. And LNG, so it's very polluting, meaning that it releases methane emissions all along the supply chain. From the point of production, from transport of LNG itself, so it's released also when it's transported, and then when it's reconverted at the terminal, so when it arrives at the European Union level, because just to clarify, LNG is liquefied gas, meaning that it's processed, liquefied, then transported by ship, and then it needs to be by a chemical procedure, by a technology procedure, then it needs to be regasified to be transported through a gas pipeline at the European Union level. So yeah, to answer to your question, yeah, it's a very polluting, and methane emission are along the supply chain, and the methane regulation now that is under discussion at the European Union level should tackle these emissions all along the supply chain, not just domestically at the European Union level.
Thank you. Yeah, and after having talked a little bit about the overall global climate impacts of that run for LNG, we are now looking at the upstream impacts of people that are actually impacted by the fracking, by the build out of the infrastructure, of the export terminals, the liquefaction terminals, etc. So we will now hear from two of the three speakers that have indeed arrived. I'm very happy that you're here with us. Let's start with you, Michael. I'll let you present yourself. What brought you here? Where are you from? And what are your personal experiences with this thirst for LNG?
Hi, everyone, and we apologize about our tardiness. We're still figuring out how to navigate this great city. But my name is Michael Esaluca. I'm an organizer in Southeast Louisiana. I live in New Orleans, which is part of a region that's known as Cancer Alley. This is maybe a 90 sort of mile stretch from Baton Rouge down through New Orleans to the Gulf of Mexico, where the Mississippi River opens into the Gulf. And we're called Cancer Alley because we have over 150 chemical plants, oil refineries, and other industrial facilities that release toxic emissions. We have 7 of the 10 US census tracts with the highest risk of cancer. And our community is what's known, what we call in the States, a sacrifice zone, because it's a region of the country that has been chosen for industrial expansion, for fossil fuel expansion, for the extraction of hydrocarbons to generate wealth that is not given back to our communities while we're left to deal with the consequences of that. So we have elevated risk of cancer. We have women who struggle to conceive or who have children that are born with birth defects. We have issues with COPD and heart disease and pulmonary disease. But we're organizing to defeat fossil fuel expansion. We've been successful in stopping or seriously delaying 5 projects over the past 3 years. But now what we're facing is a vast and massive expansion of LNG export infrastructure. So currently, there are 14 LNG export terminals that are either proposed or under construction or have just recently come online across Louisiana's coast. None of that wealth really gets delivered back to our communities, just as the fossil fuels themselves are extracted and exported abroad. All of the profits and the benefits from that system are also extracted and exported abroad. The closest LNG facility to me is called Plaquemines LNG. It's being built by a company called Venture Global, which we call Vulture Global because they're vultures, they're parasites in our community. And one of the tragic things about Plaquemines LNG is that I think this facility really exposes all of the contradictions inherent with a fossil fuel regime in coastal Louisiana. Louisiana, I'm sure everyone has heard of Hurricane Katrina. We've been hit by 4 major hurricanes in the past 3 years, and we're losing land faster than anywhere in North America. That is in large part because of the fossil fuel facilities that are dredging through our wetlands, that are digging pipeline canals and destroying the fragile marsh that protects us from storms, as well as building facilities that escalate the climate crisis that is truly lapping at the shores of our state. Plaquemines Parish, which is where this facility is being built, has lost 50% of its landmass since 1970, and that is directly caused by the devil's bargain that our leaders have made with oil and gas. As we speak, the city of New Orleans, with many other communities south of it, is currently facing a drinking water crisis. When I leave from Europe and go home, I don't know if there's going to be clean drinking water for us because we have the drought in the north that's preventing water from flowing down through the Mississippi River, which is our drinking water source. And then we have coastal land loss and saltwater intrusion because of the destruction of our wetlands that's allowing saltwater from the Gulf to travel up the Mississippi River, destroy our water infrastructure by corroding pipes so that heavy metals are leached into our water. So we don't know if our water will be safe to drink by October 20th. At the same time, this Plaquemines LNG facility would use tens of thousands of gallons of water every week just to continue on with their production. So this is what's happening. Because of the constant and growing demand for fossil fuels, our communities are literally being sacrificed. Our water is being taken away from children and given to the fossil fuel industry. And so obviously this is a great injustice, and I think every person that has a heart in this world has a responsibility to stop it.
Thank you. Yeah, so we heard about the human health impacts, the water impacts, and also a lack of resilience as a consequence also of all that fossil infrastructure, which a lot of people may not have thought about before. So thank you for these first insights. We will now hear from Elida Castillo from Texas, or a slightly different region, what the impacts are there and what the build out is linked to, potentially also some words on the petrochemical industry that's already existing and still expanding on top of, on top of this all. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Elida Castillo. As Lisa said, I am the program director for CHISPA Texas, which is a program of the League of Conservation Voters, and I'm a resident of Taft, Texas, which is located a few miles up the road from Gregory, where Cheniere LNG, aka Corpus Christi Liquefaction, is located and is currently seeking to expand its facilities because they want to increase their operations of export, and it's all for foreign consumption, despite I wish I could say like the impacts to our community were different from what Michael just stated, but we see this in all the communities where you have these facilities and this kind of fossil fuel build out. You know, where we rely on in Texas, like our grid is mostly powered by gas, fracked gas. And so whenever we see these exports, this increase in exports, it is causing our energy prices to go up, and people are struggling right now just to pay their bills, you know, and it is causing a crisis. We're hearing about the climate crisis here in Europe, you know, and the energy crisis. But at the same time, we're experiencing that back home with heat. They call it historic heat waves. We're experiencing a historic and unprecedented drought. We've been under drought restrictions for over a year and a half. And during this entire time, the fossil fuel industries in our communities are able to use as much water as they want, as long as they pay a 25-cent per every 1,000 gallons that they use. And so while communities are being told you need to conserve water and restrict your water usage, the facilities in our communities are using as much water and as much power as they want, which once again runs on gas. You know, especially one of the biggest violators is not just Cheniere, but it's also Gulf Coast Growth Ventures, which is a petrochemical industry. It's the world's largest plastics facility. And that is using up to 13 to 30 million gallons of water per day. And I wish I could calculate how much that was in the metric system, but it's a lot of water. And, you know, we can survive without natural gas. We can survive without crude oil, but we as humanity cannot survive without water. Like, we need water to survive. It is sacred. And there just isn't any respect towards these facilities. You know, especially when it comes towards, you know, with fracking. Fracking is poisoning our drinking water supplies, especially in the Permian Basin and Eagle Ford Shell. To frack, you know, to get the shell from, to get this gas from the shell, it's not an easy process. They are drilling up to 25 to 30,000 feet into the Earth's crust, and they're using millions of gallons of water mixed with sand and chemicals. And, you know, that is not being regulated, and it's leaching into our drinking water system. So, you know, water is life, and, you know, just we don't have an alternative but to decrease our consumption of fossil fuels and transition to a clean energy future.
Thank you. And as a reminder, fracking is banned in Europe, and nevertheless, Europe imports a lot of frack gas as long as these impacts occur elsewhere. That is the inconvenient truth to the story. So now we have our third speaker from the US, Chloe Torres from the Texas Campaign for the Environment. And I'd also like you to present yourself and say a few opening remarks of what brought you here and what the impacts are that you have experienced in your work and personally.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and apologies that I'm late. My name is Chloe Torres, and I am an organizer with Texas Campaign for the Environment. I have lived in Corpus Christi, Texas, my entire life. And I guess how I got here is a complicated question, but I'll say that growing up in Corpus Christi, I really bought into the narrative that it was essentially a poisonous place to live. It was a place where if you wanted to grow as a person who was like well-rounded, intelligent, successful, you have to leave, because the only places that you can make a name for yourself were either in politics, which was highly corrupt and captured by the fossil fuel industry. You could go into the fossil fuel industry, or you could work in the military. So I had aspirations of leaving Corpus Christi, but also had really, growing up in the US South, had always had a deep admiration for the civil rights movement. And what I didn't know at the time, but I now know is community organizing, just the power of ordinary people to radically transform their material conditions and change not only their community for the better, but the entire world. And so growing up, the natural beauty of Corpus Christi, it cannot be denied. Its biodiversity, its estuaries, its bays, it's gorgeous. And that was something that, I was always really proud of. And so we started to see more and more natural disasters, quote unquote, right? If they're accelerated, then I guess they're not so natural anymore. And it wasn't until, I would say, Hurricane Harvey in 2017, which is a Category 4 hurricane, did I really start to become a part of a community that knew that our local government, state and federal, weren't coming to our rescue, and we had to rely on our own resources and our own empathy and compassion for each other to make it out of the worst disaster that I've ever lived through. And so seeing people come together, even though we just, we all experienced this together, the next day helping out neighbors, pull out debris from their homes, comfort grandmothers who didn't know where they were going to stay for the next few months, and then having to leave, knowing that we didn't even scratch the surface of what kind of repair needed to actually be done. It really transformed me. One, to realize that we have a community here that is deeply caring and will look out for each other, but also that we deserve more, and we need to actually have power and change the system of power that got us into this precarious situation in the first place. So after that, I started really being taught more about the people around me, of the history of environmental racism in Corpus Christi and how dire the situation actually really was. We have a stretch of our community, miles, sorry, I also don't know how to convert that into kilometers, but 12-mile stretch of just heavily concentrated oil and gas refineries. And if you live within that area, be it 1, 2, 3 miles away, your life expectancy is 17 years lower than just 10 miles away on the other side of the city. And so we've seen a lot of people become sicker and sicker and eventually die. And that is directly related to living in such a cancerous, poisonous area. And so what we really need Europeans to understand, and why we're here and what we want to build upon, is to create the solutions that we need to have that just transition, not just for Americans, not just for Europeans, but for the entire globe. Everyone deserves to have a safe place to live, safe water to drink, clean air to breathe. And for far too long, I think our climate movement has worked in isolation, although these banks and fossil fuel companies have been global for a long time. We need to be just as global. So again, thank y'all so much for coming out and listening to our stories, and happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Thank you. This is also now a moment for you joining online to ask questions, or people here in the room. As we are kind of running short in time, I will not ask questions myself, but leave the floor directly to you. Do we have another mic for the room, please?
Thanks. David Amiago from Argus Media. I'm also Vice President of the Press Club. Europe set its sort of its targets for reducing use of fossil fuels or CO2. We've set standards for LNG and volumes as well. I was wondering, how can this impact the actual agreements or legislation that's actually there now in Europe? I mean, we press a button and we don't see what's happening. You said Cancer Valley. We don't see these effects. I was just wondering how can that really impact in the short term? In the next 5 years, we've really got all our legislation in place for the next, I don't know, Enrico, you could probably tell me, it might be 3-4 years before they start. Next year, we might hear more about 2040 targets, but that's it. We're done for the next five years, I think.
I think there's a problem there because a lot of the LNG export terminals that are being proposed in the carcinogenic coast is a term I learned yesterday, along the Gulf Coast in our sacrifice zone. They're likely not going to be built for another 3 to 5 years. They're not going to be completed and fully come online. And Europe currently doesn't have the capacity to import the LNG that we want to send it. And so what we're seeing right now is that this glut of LNG import facilities that are proposed for Germany and other places in Europe, they won't come online or be operational for another 5 years. But the contracts that they're signing with American companies will lock us in, both of our countries in, to 20 to 30 more years of LNG extraction, export, and combustion. And so it's great that that the EU is moving forward with regulations to try to reduce overall carbon emissions, but there's a lot of funny math, and the math is not mathing, is what we say. All of the methane emissions throughout the whole life cycle of LNG are not being calculated into certainly the United States carbon emissions targets. And then, your countries are making this decision to lock us into another 20 to 30 years of fossil fuel extraction and combustion, which is directly harming our communities. But perhaps Enrico can speak more to the specifics of the regulation.
Yeah, I agree with you. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. I agree with you that we already have legislation planned for also the coming years, but still we are in the phase of discussing the legislative proposals. So the legislative proposals can be changed and enhanced. And I think that it's really important also to raise public awareness of the effects of LNG, for example, imports, but also petrochemical imports to the European Union. So I think the work and the stories we are hearing today are very important also to make people understand, decision makers and general public in general, about the impacts of importing fossil fuels from the United States, but also from other places. So I still that still there is room for improvement in the current legislation. We can change it. We have a big opportunity next year with the European elections. I think, for example, the phase out of fossil fuels should be an important topic in the next European elections. And so, yeah, I think that we need to structure the next legislative phase to take into account all we heard today and the impacts, the devastating impacts of fossil fuels.
We have a question online from Tsabatot. Sorry if I massacred your name, from Berlin. We have heard of the environmental impact of fracking in the US, but what ready-made alternatives are available for LNG terminals right now at this moment?
Okay. So if I'm understanding, it's like, what are the alternatives to the LNG terminals in the short term? I believe like weatherizing our homes. You know, I think there's a way to have heat pumps and using thermal energy. Those are pretty immediate ways and low cost and effective ways, you know, that maybe don't harm our environment as much as fracking, you know, and the use of LNG, because as Michael said, you know, we don't consider the life cycle from fracking to transportation to manufacturing LNG and then the re-exportation and the regasification. And, you know, unfortunately for us, we don't have the regulations in place that monitor LNG and, you know, monitor methane leaks. And so you have pipelines and oil, gas heads, wellheads leaking all over the place. And these haven't been monitored. So before we consider like, what is the alternative? We got to look at, you know, what are the impacts of a solar spill? You know, if you have too much wind energy, like how is that poisoning our environment? You know, and really look at, you know, conservation of our electricity and looking at the alternatives that maybe don't have that lobbying industry behind them that the fossil fuel industry has, because there are better solutions, quicker solutions. And I think like we haven't really been as dependent on LNG, you know, in the recent times as we have like for the past. So we got to learn from the past and really put into place like the weatherization of our homes, conservation, and you know, just there are alternatives out there that you know, governments do have access to. It's just, do they have the will is the question.
I also want to add briefly, I second everything that Alita just said, but I learned recently that 15% of all of the gas that's imported to Europe is used to manufacture petrochemicals. And some of those certainly, you know, may be useful, but a lot of that is used to make single-use plastic. My understanding is that right now in the port of Antwerp, there's a plan by the company Ineos to build a new ethane cracker. Why do we need that? We don't need single-use plastic. Actually, all the countries that I've been to, rarely do people even give me plastic bags. So the demand for plastic is going down, and yet the industry is literally selling you this lie that we need to export gas so that we can use it to manufacture chemicals that people aren't using that are poisoning us. And so we have to question this logic of industry, this economic logic that requires the death and destruction of our communities, and say that this is not acceptable. There needs to be a better way.
And maybe just as an explanation, so petrochemicals are all these chemicals that are based on fossil fuels and that also require fossil fuels for energy. So it's used both as feedstock and as energy. And an important feedstock also in the petrochemical industry is gas, also for fertilizers. And the EU does have reduction policies when it comes to the use of the synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. But a lot of these policies are put on hold because of alleged concerns of food security, and the connections to the supply, energy security are not made. And yet they're there, as you mentioned, like 15% of gas is used to manufacture these petrochemicals, and it remains an oversight and a blind spot still in EU policies today. We had another question here in the room. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Christian Andrew with ENS Europe. So you mentioned the funny maths and how things don't add up time-wise with the export terminals, and I think the same thing with the with the imports here in Europe to a certain extent. I mean, how do you see the Commission on this? Do you think they are just naive, or are they captured by the fossil fuel industry as well? And I mean, related to that, do you have some message to the Commission specifically on this political push for LNG imports that to replace Russian gas, that they are a political push?
I will say very briefly, and then I want to, it was directed at me, but I want to give my colleagues some time to answer. But my message is that you have a grand opportunity right now to begin your transition. And you can do, like European countries have much more ability to do some central economic planning than we do in the United States. We can barely pass legislation in the US, right? So you have the possibility to build out your infrastructure for renewables instead of locking yourself into a fossil fuel death economy. And that's a choice that you can make. And your grandchildren are going to look at you and ask you why you made the choice to lock your countries into another 20 years of gas extraction and production, or they're going to congratulate you for taking the courageous stand to say, no, we need something different. And yes, and I don't know, I can't speak to the European Commission, but on the United States side, our local governments in Texas and Louisiana are completely captured by industry, and the fossil fuel, like, do not underestimate the power of the fossil fuels lobbying machine, fossil fuel industry's lobbying machine.
All the mics work, by the way.
Maybe I can briefly jump in about the European Commission and the European Union level. So I think that it's true. Fossil fuel industry is pushing to keep fossil gas, fossil fuels in general, to be in our pipelines, so to keep them alive also for the coming years. We heard before that we have solutions from electrification to push for renewable energies to demand reduction, energy efficiency. So we have the tools there. I think what is missing is a true willingness to push for a phase out yet. We are still stuck with fossil fuels, and the European Commission, even though suggested some good proposal, as for example the REPowerEU, it has some good aspects, but still it's still very linked to fossil fuels because it still finances fossil gas infrastructure, LNG build out in many European countries. So yes, I think the message should be we need to cut our dependence from fossil fuels altogether, and because there is no future for fossil fuels, I think. I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I would just kind of echo what Michael said, is like European Commission has the opportunity to be like global leaders on this front. And it would ultimately save the lives of millions, if not billions of people. It is exactly the path that we need to take to switch to renewables. And so we're talking about safer jobs for Europeans, union jobs for Europeans, but we're also talking about less cancer for our communities, less children born with defects. And if this is an economic problem, there is money to be made in renewables. So if the concern is also with GDP, there is a market for renewables. Most of the world recognizes that climate change is a crisis that requires so many different solutions. And instead of going backwards and condemning us all to a future of fire and floods, you could choose instead to save the planet. And once you hold yourself to that higher standard, you have so much influence on the global stage that other countries will surely follow. So it's not just a plea to save our communities, it's a plea to save your communities as well. Thanks.
Can I have a quick follow-up? I mean, you said there's lack of willingness, but this goes slightly further than that, right? I mean, throwing money at in Europe as well at new fossil fuel infrastructure. Surely, you know, there's not just a lack of willingness to shift to renewables. That's why I'm asking about the industry capture specifically, because it's, you know, do you see this? You know, I'm repeating my question, but with the maths don't add up. I mean, is there a real concern about industry capture in development and in Europe?
I would. Is this working? Yeah. Okay. I would say yes. I mean, the fossil fuel industry is absolutely well funded, and they have their hands in every cookie jar in every country. And now we're seeing them selling these false solutions like carbon capture and hydrogen. And, you know, we're seeing countries in the European Union buy into that. Like, we'll just, you know, use LNG for a few years, and then we'll retrofit our infrastructure for hydrogen. Which is just another false promise that the industry is selling. And I think we're putting too much in investment in the facilities in the industry that put us into this mess to take us out of it. And I think, you know, the communities know what the answer is. The people know what the answer is. Our leaders know what the answer is. And we shouldn't be investing and putting all of our faith into an industry that has been lying to us for decades, and not just for 10 years. They haven't lied to us for just 20 years. It's been over like 50 years that they've known about this issue. And now they're passing on to, you know, the solutions onto taxpayers everywhere to fund these solutions. And LNG was sold, like frack gas was sold as a clean transitional fuel. And we're seeing just within the past 5 years, like the impacts to our environment, to our health, to our water. So we need to stop buying these terrible false solutions or promises and really go with common sense. You know, because I think our political leaders want to do the right thing. They just don't do the research and the homework, and they rely too much on people feeding them the wrong data. So I would say, ask questions, push back, and stop funding false promises, because it's not going to solve anything unless we scale back like our consumption of fossil fuels.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Knowing that we have to wrap up in a timely manner because another event will start soon in this very space. Nothing online either? No? Okay. One more question?
Yeah, I have one. I'm interested in understanding what's the consequence of this massive export of LNG to Europe on the price of energy for local people, and what you have been told by authorities and companies to justify that this was impacting your bill, basically.
Sure, thank you for that question. So at Texas Campaign for the Environment, we do a lot of community outreach, which includes canvassing door to door. So asking people what their experiences are with LNG. And folks have told us that, so this industry moves in, it's promising a lot of jobs, right? We're seeing jobs not going to local community members. Then their property taxes are raised because the appraisal values of the facilities are high initially, because this is brand new technology. LNG is this, you know, amazing bridge fuel that's going to wean us off of our dependence on fossil fuels. But then we start to see the export boom, and people's electricity bills have never been higher. And we have to remember that for us, Cheniere LNG operates in a community called Gregory. It is very small. It's very rural, and 33% of the people there live below the federal poverty line. So even before Cheniere LNG came in, these people were already struggling. And then you compound that with not just higher electricity bills, but also higher healthcare costs. Texas is the state with the most uninsured people in the United States. So these nebulizers that children are having to give because they are having asthma attacks almost every day, oxygen transfusions that people are having to get because they are experiencing migraines every single day and it's causing them to miss work. All of these factors are compounded by LNG exports. So it's a really great question, and thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, the cost of that, you know, we have seen just a personal price that people are paying, not just in their electricity bills, but with their lives. Right now, as Chloe mentioned, Gregory, and we work a lot with the community as well, they don't see a future for themselves because on one side, they have Cheniere LNG, they have ArcelorMittal, an iron briquette factory. They have TETCO, which is a steel factory. They have Arcadia E-Fuels, which is an alternative fuel factory. And then on the other side, they have Gulf Coast Growth Ventures, which is a partnership between ExxonMobil and SABIC to produce plastics. And so the community is being taken over by industry. They've had a highway that is bypassing it, and now they're trying to build on the other side. So they really feel threatened by all of these industries. So it's not just a cost, a economic cost, but a mental, emotional, and a human rights violation, because these people felt that they could invest in their homes and they had homes to pass on to their children. And now their children are like, we don't have futures here. So they move away. So it is what they feel is a dying community, but they are doing everything that they can to save it, because they say, even though my town may be ugly to somebody else, it is my town. This is my home, and I'm going to fight for it. And that's what we're doing.
Wrapping this up, Michael, one last closing remarks from your side as well. Do you want to? You can. I wanted to give the floor to you before closing.
You know what? I think Alita put it very well. But one thing I will say is that my understanding is that the EU is currently negotiating a mandatory due diligence regulations that would require large companies to assess their entire supply chain for human rights violations. And I can guarantee you 100% that the fossil fuel industry throughout the entire death cycle is violating human rights, from the point of extraction in the Permian Basin to when it's transported through pipelines that leak or trains that spill or explode, to when it's exported in communities by facilities that are destroying our coastlines and poisoning us, to when it's regasified and methane leaks, and then finally with combustion. So we don't need this industry. There is a better path, and the EU, as Chloe said, has an enormous amount of leverage as global leaders, and you are also leading the way. North America is far behind, and so we are asking you please to stand with us, to stop the human rights violations, and to choose a better way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it has a lot of leverage on the global level with regards to being a leader on sustainability regulations, but also the sheer market power as such a big importer of gas. So the policing supply chains and a robust methane regulation are absolutely key in the short term, but we shall never forget that just replacing one energy source by another from elsewhere, still fossil, is not doing the job, and we need to really focus on structural gas demand reduction and not just emergency gas reduction policies. And that also includes the often overlooked petrochemical sector, which should be considered a key lever also for geopolitical reasons. So with that, thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of you online on this little camera. And we will now continue in 15 minutes with a public event. And I see that some people have already joined. So thank you for coming. And have a good day.